All right, we want to welcome everyone to our departmental assembly. And our guest speaker today comes all the way from Polytechnic University of Milan in Italy. His name is Professor Pier Giorgio Righetti. I hope I got that right. Right
Oh,
inflections, I don't know. Anyway, um, Professor Righetti earned his PhD in organic chemistry from University of Pavia in 1965. He spent 3 years as a postdoc at MIT and 1 year at Harvard. And he's currently, as I said, emeritus professor. I have given all of you who attended his bio, his short bio, so I'm not going to read everything, except to say that he is published a lot. He has been cited a lot. He has been awarded a lot. And his work is well known across the world. I can't remember specifically now where I read about his work, but my guess, as I was telling him earlier, is in CNE News. And it read very interesting to me, using chemistry to analyze Egyptian mummies, to be able to even know if some of these great artists and writers were using drugs while they were writing and doing their work. That's pretty fascinating to me. At least that's what I thought. And so I said, let's get Professor Righetti here to talk to us about his work. So without any more introduction, Professor Righetti, the time is yours.
okay. Well, good morning, Michigan, and thanks to Professor Murray for inviting me. So what I will be presenting to you is a novel technique for exploring cultural heritage documents, for it, not only documents that can be written, manuscripts, or it could be parchment, it could be Egyptian mummies, it could be uh, paintings, the surface of a painting, anything. For that, of course, one would have to be sure that one would have a technique that will not damage and will not contaminate the item under analysis. Otherwise, libraries and museums will never ever give you access to these precious items. So the methodology we invented is called the EVA film technology. EVA is an acronym. It stands for ethylene vinyl acetate. So it is ethylene vinyl acetate is a plastic that is thermally reversible. At 70 degrees, it melts into a viscous solution. We embed into it millions and millions of strong cations and anion exchanges, and also hydrophobic resins like C8 or C18. So once you have strong anions, strong cations, and hydrophobic resins, you capture any type of metabolite, be it a small molecule or macromolecule. So once these diskettes are ready, we apply them. You see here in this drawing, you see the red ones are strong cation exchanges, SCX. The blue ones are strong anion exchanges, and the green ones are C8 or C18. And here is a painting of an impressionist. So we apply it to the surface, and then we collect the film, we elute the proteins, and then we do mass spectrometry. How do we do it? Here it is. First of all, how does the capture go? This is a drawing of the EVA film. If you have a strong positive charge, it will capture proteins with an excess of negative charges, and vice versa. If you have a negative charge on the film, it will capture proteins which have an excess of positive charges. The first document, what you are seeing below here, is an original manuscript of a novel by Bulgakov, the famous master in Margarita. So let us see now how this works. So these 1, 2, 3 are actually, this is a picture of one, a photograph of one diskette. They are about 3 centimeters, 3.5 centimeters in diameter, and that's their colors, you know, kind of a brownish color. So we have the diskette that has captured proteins from any surface. What can we do? We could digest the proteins in situ on the diskette, reduce it to peptides, then capture the peptides with ZIP-T, purify them, and then go to mass spectrometer. Of course, you don't have to use an orbital fusion 3 hybrid, which is the most expensive one. In a second instance, we could elute the proteins captured. We could do an SDS page. You see this bluish rectangle here. You could excise any band, for instance, these major bands. After excision, we could digest them with trypsin and then go to mass spectrometry. Or the other alternative would be elution, trypsin digestion, and then mass spectrometry. You can read about this methodology in a very, very recent review, which has been published a couple of months ago in Journal of Proteome Research. Here you can see the reference to it. So after seeing how the method works, let us see the results. The first thing we did, we started about 5 years ago in collaboration with Dr. Zilberstein, who is also with us today and will say hello to you later on. We went to Moscow and we analyzed the original manuscript of Master in Margarita written by Mikhail Bulgakov. Now, Bulgakov had written it in 1930, but then he burned the entire manuscript because, you know, it was put in a minority. The servants, the people, the intellectual who were serving Stalin didn't like him, and he was a kind of a marginated. So he burned it, then he wrote it again. And between 1936 to 1940, he was revising his masterpiece. However, he was very sick. So he was most of the time in bed because he had a renal disease, a kidney disease that then he suffered from a nephritic syndrome that then took him to his grave. And so we said, if in these 4 years, he worked so hard in revising his manuscript, could he have taken drugs? You have to remember that he graduated as a physician, and in 1918, Lenin sent him to the front when there was the Russian Revolution. So he was a military medical doctor, and he cured patients. And in his memoirs, he said he used morphine. So we said, surely he must have been using morphine. So we went to his scripts. We analyzed 10 different pages. We took the diskettes, we eluted them, and then we analyzed the eluate with the gas chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry. This is the elution profile, and sure enough, you see this M peak at the minute 7. This is morphine, as you know, as you can see in the inset here. This is a pure morphine standard. You see the peak is coincident with that, and then of course we did the mass spectrometry, so we recognize it. So we recognize in his scripts not only morphine, but also this metabolite that our organism, if you take morphine, our organism transforms it into 6-O-acetylmorphine. So that's, we published this first article in Journal of Proteomics in 2016. But then we did more. Dr. Zilberstein had a very special program ad hoc that could not just elute the morphine from the pages, but map the morphine on the surface of the script. And here it is, you see, look at these original pages. This is the separate fragments of the initial pages 3 and 35 of the so-called chapter called Patriarch's Pond and the dialogue between Jesus and Pilatus. And look at this area up here, you know, this grayish area, darker grayish and so on. So when we mapped this region for the presence of morphine, look beneath here, down here, you see the fingerprint of the thumb, you know, the thumbprint with the levels, different levels of morphine, 2 nanograms per square centimeter on the periphery of the thumb, and then 5 nanograms, and you approach the center, 10 nanograms. So this is a genuine fingerprint, not a high resolution fingerprint, but we believe that Sherlock Holmes would have been very happy if he could have had these results in his own time. Okay, so this is quite spectacular. Now, what happened when we published this paper, the results, we were attacked by by expert of Russian literature and the Bulgakov, and they said, no, it is impossible. There is written nowhere that Bulgakov ever used morphine. So they said, this is not Bulgakov. It is, you know, when Bulgakov died in 1940, his novel was not published. Stalin sequestered it and they put it in the basement of the Lubyanka, of the KGB, you know, the Secret Service. So they said, it was the Secret Service people who went down in the basement of the Lubyanka to read the novel. Imagine, Secret Service agents are not smart people, are not intellectuals. So without that they could have done it. In any event, we went back to Moscow and we applied again to other different pages, the diskettes, but these times we looked not for metabolites like morphine, we looked for proteins. And then we captured the proteins, we eluted them, and among the proteins, you know, salivary proteins that you could easily leave on the margins of your writings, you know. We looked for, we detected 3 particular proteins which are here listed: N-acetylglucosaminidase, periostin, and nephrin, that are today known to be biomarkers of the renal disease that took poor Bulgakov to his grave. Now, it is impossible that all KGB agents suffer from the same pathology. And then, you know, we think that if you are a secret agent, you don't take morphine that depresses your wits. You would take cocaine, heroin, whatever, you know. So that was it. So we published this paper in Journal Proteomics the year after, in 2017. Then we went back to Moscow again. We investigated the writings of Anton Chekhov. As you know, he was one of the most famous playwrights in his time, but also in modern times. So in the left picture here, you can see Anton Chekhov. But in the right picture, you see something very extraordinary. You see this young lady is Sophia Loren, that went to the Novodevichy Cemetery at the grave of Anton Chekhov to read it, to see it, maybe to say pride. Now, Sophia Loren was a very, very young, maybe she was 20 years old, she was not so famous. But how could she, in 1960, 61, 62, we do not know when this picture was taken, how could she go to Moscow in those days? It could have been impossible. Probably it was the Italian Communist Party that sent her to Moscow, and they recommended to her to visit Anton Chekhov's grave to show that she was an intellectual, you understand? So this is it. Now, Anton Chekhov too, he died of tuberculosis. He had tuberculosis. Now, Chekhov too was a physician. He knew he had tuberculosis, and the bacterium was identified by Koch in 1882, I believe 20 years before Chekhov died. And so we said, if he died of tuberculosis, can we see in his documents traces of the bacterium that brought him to his grave? So we went to this museum. There is a museum in Melikovo, which is 60 to 80 kilometers outside of Moscow. It was his dacha, you know, it was his belonging, and now is his museum. So we went there. We looked at some documents that were on the desk and so on, but we could find nothing at all. But as luck goes, here in a special in a sealed cabinet, there was you see the shirt he wore on his deathbed when he died, and down here at the very bottom you can see in Cyrillic letters A.C. Anton Chekhov, you know, these initials. So they opened this cabinet and we put, you see this red dot here, we put in the color the Eva diskette. We left it there for an hour, then we took it out, we eluted, and we said, well, let's see if we are lucky and we find this bacterium, you know. And we were lucky because as luck goes, this, you see, this shirt in which he died, it was kept religiously by the wife. She never washed it, she never did it. She put it in a sealed cabinet and then she donated it maybe 20, 30 years after his death to this museum. So look at the eluate of this Eva diskette, look at it. by a meta-proteomic approach. We investigated any possible Mycobacterium, the Africanum, bovis, Microtic mungi. We excluded them. And then finally, this is the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. When we went down to the, the underground metro line. And there we found these two peptides. They are very specific. They are proteotypic peptides of this protein, this 8-amino 7 oxo nano 8 synthase that is very specific for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So there is a clear evidence that the Mycobacterium tuberculosis was still there, existing in the shirt, in the collar. Of course, most probably it was not any longer, it was inactive, it must have been absorbed by the tissue and it was not contagious any longer, but it was still there, remarkably, some 120 years after his death or so. Another thing, then we went back, this is my country, Milano, my home. And in Milano in 1630, between May and November, there was a tremendous bout of plague that almost obliterated half of the population of Milano and the entire region of Lombardy. So probably there were more than 200,000 victims. It was a huge, huge disaster. Now, just outside one of the main gates of the town, there was this lazaretto. The lazaretto was a huge, huge structure that was, imagine, 270, almost a square, 275 times 275 meters. So it was gigantic, And unfortunately, this gigantic lazaretto, these are the only 6 rooms of the lazaretto existing today, by the end of last century, the capitalistic society decided to destroy almost everything, and that is what we have left. So, of course, there is nothing there in the lazaretto to be seen, but the death registries of the lazaretto, we found out they were stored in the state archives in Milano. And here are the state archives in Milano. Is a fantastic, beautiful structure. If you ever come to Milano, you should visit it. It was built in 1600 to train, priests for the Catholic Church. And now is a state archives in this Via Senato. So we entered the state archives, and up there we found there must have been probably 100, maybe 100, 200 of these death registries, but there are only a dozen or so surviving. So we went through these death registries, we screened all of them, and then we analyzed the 20 most promising pages. Which were the most promising pages? The ones that had the margins highly polluted, the most polluted possible margins. And so now let me show you, this is one of the pages of the death registries. It is of the 9th of September, 1630, when, the plague was still raging, was still very, very active. And here you can see, there is the date, here it is in Latin, die ante dicto, because there were several pages of this 9th of September. So they say, this is the day we discussed in the previous page. So you see, in each entry, there is the name of the person that died. And here it says the name of the person, it says the age, here it says anno 60, and then it says febbre acuta, so high fever, but also ex peste obit. So this is in everything. Ex peste obit means he died of plague. And then there is the name of the physician who issued the report. But the physicians in those days, they wouldn't enter the lazaretto. You know who were the physicians? They were the barbers. And in Latin, it was barbitonsoris. So there it is. The barbers, like you had, remember in the West, in the far West, when you colonized the far West, the barbers were following the colons and they were extracting tooth, they were doing medicaments and so on. So here it is. So here in this line, it is 2 little girls, one of 4 and one of 5, and they died of peste obit, or it is stated also in Morta di Peste in Italian and so on. And all of them are barbitonsaurus, so they are barbers. So we put the diskettes down here in the right bottom part that was very heavily contaminated. We analyzed 20 different pages, and then we eluted them, and sure enough, look at that. This is, again, we do a meta-proteomic approach. You see how we excluded any possibility. You see, we took all the peptides, we put in all bacteria databases, then we eliminated all the bacteria that were not giving us any results. You see the cyanobacteria, chlamydobacteria, etc., then down, down, and down, the Yersinaceae, and finally the Yersinia pestis. And we found 22 different proteins with prototypic peptides of this. Here, there is a list of them specific of this protein. So this was a big, big success. And we published that in Journal of Proteomics in 2018. Now, the title was interesting. You see, remember, of Mice and Men. It's the title also of a very famous American novel. And this, it had a resonance in the world over. TV talked about it, newspapers all around the world, and we were absolutely fascinated by that. And we thought, why, the plague in Milano should be so popular, everybody around the world would discuss about it. Well, you should realize that the plague has been pestering humanity since millennia. If you open the Iliad, the first few verses of the Iliad say that Mercury, being upset with the invaders, Agamemnon and his troops in front of Troy, he sent the plague in the army of the Achaea, that is of Agamemnon. So the plague has been always in constant worries all around humanity. But this was not, in a way, it is good to know that, the Yersinia pestis was still there, but, and it is good to know that we've found such a tremendous evidence, but we found something very, very unique and very, very new. That means not, and that is the world premiere, not 800% of the people who died of plague, which was easily identified by the bubons, About 2% of the population died by infection, the lung infection from Bacillus anthracis, the anthrax disease. Remember, anthrax became very popular at the turn of the century when some people sent the anthrax to the senators, of the United States Congress. The anthrax is a black powder, this bottle. Now, if you inhale it and it goes to your lungs and you have a defective immune system, it will give you a tremendously high fever and you will die within 48 hours. So 2% of the population was dying of the high fever, and now we know the responsible was the Bacillus anthracis, the anthrax disease. Then there was another bacterium here, which is interesting, but I will not talk about it because the referees refused to accept the evidence of this methyl-bium petrolae film. That is a bacterium that digests petrol, and there is a very long story behind it, but I would skip it. So in any event, the story of the plague in Milano was perhaps the most popular of the paper we ever published so far. Then we went to Paris. In Paris, in the National Bibliothèque Nationale, in the National Library in Paris, there are the Memoirs of Casanova. And in his memoirs, Casanova wrote that he had during his life, he's a famous lover, but he was a real genius, actually, not just simply a lover as it went down due to Mozart, Leporello, who wrote this Conquest. In reality, he was a genius in many, many fields, but he was also a famous lover. He had about 120 ladies in his life, whom he loved a lot. And he says he had at least 9 bouts of gonorrhea. So we said, maybe by exploring, his memoir of his life, we will find the gonorrhea bacillus. And so when we wrote this paper, we wrote it with a funny title in French, Il n'y a pas d'amour heureux pour Casanova. Il n'y a pas d'amour heureux is the title of a very famous song of a French singer, Georges Brassens, which I, take this title, go to YouTube and listen to this song. It's memorable. So we took the line of this song to write this paper. But let me tell you, this is the frontispiece of this Histoire de ma vie. And it's a beautiful one. I saw it, you know, it was magnificent. You see, Histoire de Jacques Casanova, the Saint-Gall, you know, it's a title he gave to himself, you know, was not a Chevalier de Saint-Gall. Vérité, so véritable, you know, true story, écrit par lui-même, written by himself, at Doux. Doux is a town in which there is a castle in which he was a guest in Bohème. And that's, you know, so this is another place that, another page that we saw. You see these rectangles now, these gray rectangles. We put 4 rectangles on the margins here and 2 small rectangles cut into pieces here and there within the writing. And we harvested them and we tried to look for the traces of gonococcus, but there was no way we could find any gonococcus at all. But then we understood, we were very naive because we talked to physicians, and even in vivo, if you are infected by gonococcus, it's extremely difficult to find it in your body. They have to use very high sensitivity immunofluorescence detection to detect the bug. It's very, very difficult even in vivo, so imagine in a paper. But, however, we found out that in several of the pages, there were tiny red dots. You know, a red dot, we thought it could have been, and then when we analyzed it with a special monitor that Silberstein had developed, we analyzed for mercury, and it turned out that these red dots were mercury sulfide. Now, the mercury sulfide, you know, it's a pigment that in the Middle Ages is called the cinnabar. And in the Middle Ages, painters were using to paint in red the mantle of the saints, of the Madonna, and so on. Nobody knew that actually, you know, this mercury sulfide is highly toxic. So we imagine that quite a few of the medieval painters, of religious painters, maybe they died intoxicated by mercury sulfide. But it turned out that starting since 1493, when you know, Christopher Columbus sailors came back to Europe, they were infected by syphilis very heavily. They thought it was plague in those days. Nobody had ever seen syphilis before. And they used this cinnabar to cure them. And they killed the bug, and they killed also the poor patient because they gave them 10 grams per day. 10 grams per day would kill an elephant. So they were killed. But then during, you know, the centuries on, they used to cure gonorrhea by painting locally with, you know, a cream containing cinnabar. And we found this cinnabar. So we thought that maybe when Casanova was writing his memoir, he had again a bout of gonorrhea, and he was curing it with cinnabar, and we dropped some traces of the pigment in it. So we have indirect evidence that he had gonorrhea. So that was it. But let me tell you, screening this Casanova, seeing the original documents that nobody has ever been able to have access to it. You know, we had to knock at the door of this museum for a whole year to get access to this document for barely 1 hour in August, you know, make sure that nobody could see it. So that was it. So it was fascinating, this story. So can you imagine how we ended up? Who reported on our findings? Playboy in Czechoslovakia, in USA. So we even ended up in Playboy with our story of Casanova. Of course, in a way, you would believe this thing would be, you know, of interest to Playboy. So then we went to St. Petersburg. You know, in St. Petersburg, there is a huge collection of the writings of Kepler, 3,500 pages, the biggest collection in the world. As you know, Kepler was a very famous astronomer. And in 1600, he was invited to the court of Rudolf III in Czechoslovakia, and he became the astronomer of the emperor. But you know, he learned. He lived 11 months together with a very famous Danish astronomer who was really, you know, he was a furious alchemist, this Danish astronomer. So we thought maybe he made, you know, he was contagious and he propagated his religions of alchemy to Kepler. So we said, let us see if Kepler ever did any alchemy at all. In order to do that, we would have to capture traces of metals in his writing. To capture traces of metal, we had to prepare a totally different diskettes, not any longer containing strong cation, strong anion exchanges, but metal chelators. As you see, this is EDTA, you know, ethylene diamino tetracetic acid, and DMSA and so on. So we embedded into our diskettes 3 different metal chelators. Then we screened many pages, you know, hundreds of pages of this Kepler. You know, in those days, he was writing a book that he dedicated to Hipparchus. You know, Hipparchus was a Greek astronomer. But in reality, this book, as you can see these drawings, it was a book about the movement of the moon around the Earth. You know, he studied the orbiting of our satellites. You see the drawings here. But we investigated very many. And then, you know, we placed the diskettes around several pages. We eluted them. And this time, we did inductively coupled plasma analyzer mass spectrometry. And sure enough, this is just an example to show you. Look at that, the signals of arsenicum, silver, Ag silver, gold, lead, and mercury. Mercury as chloride and also gold and complexes of gold and mercury. So that is clearly that he must have been doing, perhaps, you know, secretly, he must have been doing, you know, playing around with alchemy. Now, when we published this paper, oh, there was a big protest from newspapers around the world because they said, it's written nowhere. Nobody has ever reported that Kepler ever did any alchemy or played around with that. Well, of course, you know, alchemy was strictly forbidden by the church. And at that time, when he was working in Prague at the court of Rudolf III, that was part of the Holy Roman Empire under the Catholic Church, if he had declared that he was doing alchemy, he could have been condemned as an heretic. He could have been burned at the stake. Of course, he never said a word about it. But, you know, our data are very strong. He played for maybe part of his life, then maybe abandoned. So now, let me talk about, you know, possibly, maybe you don't know about this homage to Catalonia that George Orwell wrote in 1938, just upon returning from the Spanish Civil War. But surely, you know, 1984 is most famous novel because, you know, even today, Big Brother is watching you, you know, and the Animal Farm, which I recommend to you if you have never read. Animal Farm, you can read it in an afternoon, but it's a beauty, it's a jewel, really. And 1984, truly, even today, is absolutely a hot topic even today because Big Brother is watching us, you know, through they are monitoring our computers, they are monitoring our cell phones, they are monitoring us in the streets. We are spied everywhere constantly, most unfortunately. So he won at the Spanish Civil War, and he was wounded in the neck. He almost, you know, he almost risked his life. And then after 6 months, he escaped. He went back home because, you know, they accused him to be a spy of the fascists. He was risking his life, so he went back home. And when he went back home, so imagine this letter was written in the 2nd of July, 1937. When he was hospitalized in Barcelona to cure his neck wound, he got infected by tuberculosis as well. And then when he went home, he wrote this letter to Sergei Dynamov, the editor, chief editor of a journal called Foreign Literature in Moscow. And this is the only letter that was ever written by him to Russia, and is the only letter stored in this Russian government archive of literature and arts in Moscow. And we thought, let's see if we are lucky and we find the tuberculosis bacterium in this letter, which would be almost a magic, you know, a miracle, because this letter is typewritten, it's not even handwritten. The only handwriting is his signature down here, you see, George Orwell. In this letter, he was telling to this guy, if you want to translate my novel, The Road to Wigan Pier, you must be careful because I was in the poem, and the poem was the, you know, Stalin didn't like the poem because they were Trotskyists. So he said, be careful about that. It was very nice. So we placed 2 diskettes up here, 1 diskette here, and 2 diskettes down at the bottom of the page that you cannot see. Then we took the 5 diskettes, we eluted them, and sure enough, you see this A is the tree view of the found bacteria or super kingdom. The B is the tree map of found bacteria again. And then the C is again a meta-proteomic approach that allowed us to find the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, this very special to these 2 peptides prototypic of isocitrate lyase, which is typical of tuberculosis. So again, we were able to detect this Mycobacterium tuberculosis. As I tell you, it was a miracle because it was in a typewritten letter. And you could say, well, how could you do it? What is the negative control? Now, this is interesting. The Mycobacterium tuberculosis, let us go back a moment, was found in these diskettes up here, this other diskette, and it is here. But in the 2 diskettes down below that you are not seeing here, we found nothing. And that figures, when you remove from the typewriter a page, you take it from the 2 upper corners, and so he left the fingerprints in the 2 upper corners down here, but not in the two lower corners, which were the negative control. So we had indeed negative controls. Okay, so after, you know, talking about Orwell, that was also connected, you know, fighting against the fascists, but he also had problems with the communists and the Comintern. Let us now go to Russia. And this, what we see here is the Stalin funerals. You know, Stalin died the 2nd of March, 1953, but his death was kept secret for a whole week until, because he was in agony. Then he died a few months later. But, you know, nobody knew about that because there was a big fighting among the Comintern people about his succession. So this is the funeral, a famous funeral. But let me tell you, 6 persons were fighting to success to him. And look at up here, I don't know if you see this upper point of the star. This fellow with the glasses is Lawrence Beria. The one next to him below is Nikita Khrushchev. The one to the right is Kaganovich. Down below is Bulganin, Anastas Mikhailov, and George Malenkov is the guy who is sweeping his front head with the... There is a 7th fellow. Who is the 7th fellow? Is Molotov, yes, the one of the famous Molotov bomb. But he didn't fight for the succession. As luck goes, you know, Beria took the power, but then he was overthrown. Beria was the most dangerous fellow. He was worse than Stalin because he was the head of the KGB. He had 1 million KGB secret agents. If he had taken power, Russia would have been in even worse disaster than Stalin. Thanks God, Khrushchev, that was a more moderate, took power. So what did we do? We found, let us go back to 1941, 1942. During Hitler's invasion, you know, in June 1941, there was the first attack of Hitler toward Moscow and St. Petersburg, and then he repeated that in 1942 and went down to Stalingrad. And during the Hitler's invasion, Stalin was furiously reading and rereading a book that I will tell in a moment. And within the first void page of this novel, this famous novel, there is, you see here in the left, there is a handwriting with a pen. He wrote impressions He wrote numbers on which here in the right are translated partially. Here it talks about avia station, nitroglycerin factory, speak with Shaposnikov, teacher, clarity, and so on and so forth. So it is clear that this writing referred to the Second World War because he was, worried about the gasoline production, the nitroglycerin production, and Shaposnikov was the chief general, the chief of the army. So what we did, we put our diskettes in several empty places around this space, 10 diskettes. We eluted them and look, by sheer luck, what we found. We found lithium chloride and lithium carbonate. And so the paper that we published, that is very recent, it was published a few months ago in Analytical and Bioanalytical Chemistry. It was titled Stalin Black Dog, a post-mortem diagnosis. This is the first clinical chemistry report on the health of Stalin, showing that he was taking lithium salts because he had a bipolar depression. He was bipolar, And why did we call it black dog? Because it is known during, but even much before World War II, Winston Churchill was also suffering from bipolar depression. And Winston Churchill knew he had this bipolarity, and they called this bipolarity the black dogs. So we said, well, now we also know that Stalin was bipolar like Winston Churchill, and so we call it black dog to recall the disease of Winston Churchill. Now, I will not tell you the fighting, the tremendous fighting we had with the referees in publishing this article, because one referee asked for immediate rejection, stating that we had invented our data, it was a forgery, because Stalin could not have been cured with lithium salts in 1941, 1942, because this pathology, the cure for this pathology, was reported for the first time ever in 1949 by an Australian physicist. But this guy who asked for rejection was an ignorant. He didn't know that the cure for bipolarism with lithium salt had been already reported in 1875 by a physician in New York. So it was reported almost 70, 80 years before Stalin, and it was known in early 1900. It was used all throughout Europe. So this cure for this pathology was well known. So in any event, here it is. You can read this story of the black dog. So this is just to show you what we have done. Well, we could have done much more, but I want to finish by revealing what was Stalin reading. Was reading this book written by Alexei Nikolaevich Tolstoy in 1937 about Ivan the Terrible, which in Russian is called Ivan the Terrible. In Russian sounds like Ivan Grozny. And Ivan Grozny, this book was written in 1937 by Alexei, which was connected with the famous Tolstoy who wrote War and Peace. He was also a count. He lived in Paris as a young boy, then he moved to Russia, and he wrote this book. This book, he wrote it as an homage, to Stalin. So the figure behind Ivan the Terrible was Stalin, who had also unified and was fighting against the fascists and so on. Now, this book was the one that Stalin was reading, and he was very happy about that because he knew it was a tribute paid to him. But then this book was so famous that Sergei Mikhailovich Eisenstein made a movie in 1944 in honor of Stalin. And if you see this movie, I saw this movie, you can see it in internet. It's fascinating. There are these gigantic scenes with people, I recommend it to you. So here you see in the left, Ivan the Terrible. Here you see the lithium, the lithium box in Mendeleev Mendeleev table, and here you see the Stalin. And I would like, the time has elapsed, so I would like to finish here by paying a tribute to my friend Gleb Silberstein and his wife Svetlana in front of the State Archives in Milano, and then Alfonsina D'Amato, who did a lot of mass spectrometry work that we have represented here. And here she was interviewed by our TV in Italy. And now that we are approaching the end, if Gleb is around, we want to thank Sherlock Holmes for this investigation. Now, if Gleb is connected, Gleb, can you talk and say hello to people? Gleb, can you hear me? Is he talking to us? No.
Hello to everyone.
Ah. So I hope you can see him. Can you show up yourself? Oh, no.
We can see him.
Ah, okay, good. Ah, here it is. Yeah, okay. So, I'm glad. You see, Gleb is the person behind it. He is the chemist who invented all this technology. And I am really happy that I've been collaborating with him, and we keep collaborating. And there might be very hot news in the very near future. Now, if any one of you, I think we are in perfect timing, has any questions, please, shorter question to Gleb Silberstein, to me, to whoever.
All right. So first of all, thank you very much. Everybody needs to give you a round of applause for this. This was like one of the most fascinating seminars that I've listened to, because it crossed arts and sciences, chemistry and history, literature. It was like amazing. I hope when we put this online, more people around campus listens to this. Whether you're doing English or history or whatever, you need to listen to this.
Politics, don't forget politics.
That's right, that's right. Anyway, the floor is open for questions. You guys could unmute yourself and ask questions.
Don't you be shy. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, David, you have a question? Nova?
Yeah. Is there any evidence that your technique leaves a residue on the document?
Not at all. We have published a couple of papers. I will send the reference. They were at the very beginning of this talk, the reference with the first name by Manfredi. And we analyzed even paintings and so on. There was no contamination, because the only way to contaminate them would be that, part of the, the resins embedded in the plastic would leave the plastic and contaminate. We did it even the surface of frescoes, imagine paintings. There is no way that the beads can be released by the plastic. And we even didn't damage, we did it even in frescoes of 1600 and so on. There was no damage whatsoever.
It had to be one of your toughest jobs, is to convince curators of that fact.
Yeah, no, at the beginning, yes, it was hard. But then curators were really convinced, so much so that I didn't have time to report it here. But even we went in St. Petersburg, at the Heritage, the famous museum, the Heritage Museum, they let us put 5 diskettes in a painting attributed to Leonardo. In reality, it's more his school, the Leonardo, which is called Donna Nuda. It's Donna Nuda. They let us do these 5 diskettes, and there was no damage, no contamination whatsoever. And by the way, this there was no time to talk about it, but it's an amazing article that I hope you will be able to read. It has an incredible story. We found for the first time that it was using an oil that nobody knew about that, not even Vasari in the books about Renaissance artists. He knew that Leonardo was using special essences, but he didn't know what it was. Well, one of the oils that Leonardo was using, and we discovered it for the first time, was rosemary oil. Can you imagine that? So they distillate rosemary, and they had rosemary oil. In fact, when we removed the diskettes and we smelled that, we felt the smelling of rosemary, and then we felt smelling of pine trees because they put in pine resins to protect the painting. So, and then of course there was no time about it. There was this paper about the Egyptian mummy that has been published very recently. And now we are writing a paper on a mammoth found in the permafrost, a 42,000 years old mammoth in the gut. You know, we are analyzing the gut of this mammoth. The paper is ready, we are writing it, and hopefully within a few months we also will have the mammoth. And we have also some secret things, maybe Ziv, Gleb, you want to talk about them? We have some secret.
Yeah, I was actually had a question about Leonardo, and I guess you did answer my question, because that's another really famous person that of history that you know, people are interested in learning more and more about. So, are you doing some more on him?
Well, we have just yeah, we have just published a paper together with Gleb Zilberstein with a software that he developed, showing some hidden way of representation. You know, Leonardo and also Botticelli and others in the Renaissance had paintings and also Raphael had paintings about just the Madonna in child, you know, just these two. And, you know, if you look at this Madonna in child of the Renaissance of Leonardo, Botticelli, and Raffaello, there is a special feeling you get when you see these paintings, which is totally different from the Madonna in child, the thousands of the Madonna in child represented in the Byzantine period, you know, the Byzantium painters. And, you know, thanks to the technique developed by Gleb Zilberstein, we understood why. There is this radial distribution of the figure. So we have this paper that was published a couple of weeks ago about the radial distribution of images of the head of the child and the head of the Madonna are encircled in larger and larger circles. And it gives a magic atmosphere to this. So you should read that. I will send you the reference to it if you want to read it.
Oh yes, I definitely want to. Absolutely.
Something more about that. Okay. Hopefully.
So John Roback, you have a question, and then David Randall has a question. You guys could unmute and ask a question.
Maybe John has stepped away.
Okay.
For a minute.
Okay.
So as I understand it, some metals like mercury and arsenic and lead, they have different isotopic ratios depending on like where they're from. So like, I don't know if all of those ones have or other ones, but is it so when you're talking about the Casanova memoir and also the Kepler's notes as well, you mentioned that you found these metals. And so I was wondering if it's possible to like pin down or at least give a generalized location where these materials might have been mined from, or?
Maybe Gleb can answer to that. Gleb?
Yeah, because we paid special attention to isotopic content of these elements. Of course, it's one of the best way to make some of geotagging of different pigments and different inorganic inorganic compounds inside of artifacts, inside of manuscripts, etc. Because of course, one direction it's proteomic analysis, another direction it's isotopic analysis of inorganic components of artifacts or manuscripts. And yes, you are right. It's a geotagging. It's a good way to bioisotopic analysis in our direction.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You need super duper sensitivity too, right? To see an extra 1% of whatever. So thank you.
And another way we make extraction also for NMR, because NMR also give us some very detailed information about isotopic content for hydrogen, and it's give opportunity to make analysis not only for inorganic components but also for organic components too, by isotopic analysis by NMR. Yeah.
Wow, this is truly fascinating to me. I mean, this is a field that I think, honestly, some of the students that are listening should like think about, because again, it to me brings together your knowledge in science in general, in chemistry, which is central and essential. As well as playing around with literature and history. I mean, it's rich. So how did you, because Dr. Righetti, so were you always interested in this intersection between the chemistry that you were developing and looking at real world historical documents and stuff?
Well, let me tell you the truth. I am a chemist by an accident, because
Okay.
my father was a poet.
Ah, okay.
I studied humanities, but my father was a poet, but he was very poor. We always had a hard time in living. He never made enough money. So I said, poetry will be very poor. Maybe it's rich intellectually, but then if you have to live and raise your children, maybe it's not the best solution. So I started chemistry.
Okay.
And at the very beginning, it was very hard to accept chemistry. So I had to, then, I moved from chemistry to biochemistry, which is more acceptable, But all of I cultivate literature. I read a lot, and recently I wrote 2 novels, actually.
Oh.
I wrote, yes. I can send you the covers of them. Unfortunately, I didn't have it. But maybe if someone can translate in English. There are 2 books about World War II.
Okay.
I think they are fascinating, but I never managed to sell it to any American publisher. But they have, there is a window in World War II that nobody has ever explored. And so I have been exploring these 2 windows, and I think I made nice stories. So maybe if you find a nice American, publisher, I can send you a copy. They can translate it, and maybe we will. I'll give you a share, whatever, the few dollars.
Our university press might be interested. I don't know.
Okay. I'll send you.
Let's make a deal.
How is your university press? How is it called?
Andrews University Press, I believe, is the name. Yeah.
Maybe we can start with them and then work it out.
Why not? Yeah. So anybody has other questions? I know it's 12:30 here and 6:30 there in Milan. Anybody else has any other thoughts, questions? Randall, do you want to have the honor of closing us out?
Or if you like it, Gleb could tell you some secrets of some more recent investigation. Gleb, you want to talk about Count Vlad?
Our job crack secrets, not keep secrets. No, we have different projects, and maybe some interesting for you, because we make some investigation of continuing investigation of George Orwell participants in civil war in Spain, and also we continue work with painting in Renaissance, and you know, it's many different activity, and some activity looks like a bit sporadical, but I don't know. It's up to our choice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, very good. We probably, you know, there's a very good possibility we could have you guys back again because I could listen to this more and more. Hey, David, Randall, you want to just kind of close us out on this?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for sharing this really interesting research. And like Dr. Murray was saying, it's amazing to see all these different areas coming together, right? Of history and humanities and science. And it just, you know, reminds us that there's really kind of only one set of truth, right? And then we all have different lenses that we look at that from. So thank you again for joining us from Milano, and we will say goodbye. So thank you very much. We're very grateful.
Thanks all of you for listening. Okay, take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So we go.